I've come to the Grail myth more as a poet than a scholar. Okay, that's the first thing you should know. I came to the Grail myth because I wanted to write what I call poetry ritual theater, related to the myth and its themes. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I'm part of a movement, an international movement called the Grail. And we were having a 50th anniversary of Grailville, and I was asked to create something to commemorate that. Grailville is our national center in Ohio. But in order to do that, in order to write this poem, I had to find out what it was. And as I began to do that, I became totally enmeshed in what was an endlessly fascinating, an endlessly mysterious collection of themes and symbols and stories and characters and archetypes, and its connection to history and culture. Earliest culture, the medieval culture in which it emerged, and its relevance to our world today. I have not begun, I have not ended that searching into this myth. I suspect that there are people here who know as much, perhaps even more than I do. But I did have to study, and I did have to learn something. But the first thing to know was, first I wrote the poem. I did all the reading, and let it fire my imagination. And then I sat down and wrote this ritual theater piece called The Circle and the Light, A Search for the Holy Grail. And because the poetic intelligence is different from the rational intelligence, once I had done that, and I understood, well, I'm going to have to be able to make introductions to this ritual that appeal also to the rational intellect, then I had to go back again and start over and start taking rational notes. And I've been doing that now ever since the poem was created, and the piece has been presented in a number of places, and it will be presented again here in Philadelphia in March. And I'll talk more about that this afternoon. So that as I approach this material this morning, it will be more from a poetic, spiritual appreciation to the meanings of these things. I'm going to give as much information as I can about the cultural, historical context in which it occurred, the basic story, knowing that there are all kinds of stories. That's probably part of the problem when people come to the myth. They hear one piece, then they hear another piece, and those pieces seem to contradict. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. The thing is that there are multitudes of real stories. I've tried to extract what I see as the basic story, and I'll be presenting some of that here. And we'll find the different streams in which the stories have emerged and some of the origins of the myth. And we might find that it's not exactly what we thought it was. The first signs of the myth emerge as we recognize it, as it came passed down to us, was in the world of the Celts. It's pre-Christian. And it comes down through oral tradition, through the bards, the Welsh bards, principally, who migrated to Brittany in France. And because of historical forces at the time, it ended up in the courts of France as a bardic story, and was eventually written down in French by, forgive me, I don't have the correct accent. Christiane Victor. Thank you very much. And that was around, and the stories are placed as being written between 1190 and 1225. And the whole spectrum of Grail stories emerged in that time, 1190 to 1225. Written. This is the first written account of a whole series of Grail stories that were placed ostensibly in what later became known as Britain, but first emerged in France. And everything that came after that was built upon what was written in those approximately 50 years. Now, when people usually think of what the Grail story might be, they're usually getting their information from a version of the story that emerged sometime around 1600, which was Sir Thomas Malory's story, Morte d'Arthur. And that was really the bridge between those first stories and all that later emerged. It introduced the Grail to what was to become the modern world. Now, Malory's story took those earlier stories and sort of played down the spirituality and played up the romance, and the whole Lancelot and Guinevere thing got really prime time in that. And Arthur was a major figure. And the search for the Grail was in there, but not as prominent as it might have been in those earlier stories. And many of the elements of those earlier stories were not necessarily carried forward into Malory's story, because really he was more interested in chivalry and knighthood and the heroic code and all of those things, which in fact is disappearing by then. It was a form of nostalgia. They had to try to capture it in this Grail story. But out of that, it just passed on through the centuries. And so we get things like Wagner's Parsifal later as an opera. The man was so obsessed with the myth that he built a temple, a Grail temple, and this was the only place that his opera would be performed during his lifetime. Out of it we get Tennyson's poem, The Idylls of the King, and right on through to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is a direct retelling of the imagery of the Grail, but in terms of the wasteland, which he was perceiving our 20th century as becoming and reflecting. T.H. White, I think, back in the 60s, brought us The Once and Future King. That was a real taking up of Malory's and boom, down to the 1960s. And then, with the oncoming of feminism, we get another way of looking at it. Doing the Myths of Babylon, which I found magnificent. I must say it was really my way into truly loving the myth in a way and having it personalized and given flesh. Highly recommended. I mean, even so far as when we, Tennyson wrote how the Grail cup just where it came in on a shaft of light into the round table. In the Myth of Babylon, it was being carried by Morgaine, who I believe was not biblical. Or if she was, the way the men decided to tell her that she wasn't there, it was just the cup they were seeing. Modern switch. Then, of course, there's what happened in the film, the movie, someone already mentioned, That was terrific. He was also his father, right? Searching for the Holy Grail. I loved it. I forget what that's, the last crusade. Was that the last crusade? Indiana Last Crusade. We're going to talk about this crusade. So it's interesting that he named the film The Last Crusade. Monty Python.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody said Monty Python. I don't know, did anybody really like that movie?
Oh, it's wonderful.
You liked it? I couldn't get there.
The more you know about Arthurian legends, the funnier it gets.
Robin Williams was terrific in The Fisher King, which took the myth and put it right down in New York City. Beautiful. The wastelands underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. Excalibur is another one focusing on the sword. Star Wars. Star Wars is another retelling of the Grail story, but placed far into outer space and into the future. Skywalker, is that his name? Was a Parsifal. And then, of course, there's Camelot. And that age of Camelot we were supposed to have had with the Kennedys, or at least Kennedy wanted us to have it. Paintings galore. And modern references which keep coming up more and more. You read the newspaper and whatever's going on and it will refer back to, and this is their Holy Grail, or they're searching for their Holy Grail, or everyone's talking about the Holy Grail. Well, Joseph Campbell and Jean Houston, still know Jean Houston? Hillary Clinton, occult consultant. Done a lot of work in what you call sacred psychology, have called the Grail the quintessential myth of the Western world and of our time. It is a Western myth, true. What we're going to find out is that it didn't just come out of Europe, and that it in fact is related to the Near East, to the Far East, and not to mention the Celtic world, which is, may or may not be considered a part of Europe, depending upon how you want to define Europe, or the Europe that we now think of as certain civilizations. So it's a Western myth that sort of amalgamated a variety of cultural forces and emerged, and has come down through the centuries to us, and we're still talking about it. It's an esoteric subject, and at the same time it's popularized. Let's look at where it began, how it first emerged. It came out of a Europe that was basically a mess. It was, some say, a time not so different from our own, but perhaps somebody must have started a novel like that. It was a time not so different from our own. Perhaps all times are not so different from our own. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. On the one hand, Europe was in a state of social chaos, fragmentation, a whole lot of small kingdoms fighting amongst themselves, marauding bands of knights and bandits and no-gooders, and just seeing what they can get and who they could rape and what they could do, and, that kind of thing. There was famine, disease, bad weather, in general, not such a happy time for a lot of people. Could have helped to give birth to the image of the wasteland. It felt like that. The Catholic Church at that time was the only social institution that could be a unifying force. That's important. And it was the main and most powerful political force in Europe at that time. And it intended to keep that. It was not only a spiritual or religious institution, it was a political institution. And it was the most powerful and the most pervasive and the most unifying in Europe at that time. So it was that on the one hand. On the other hand, it was post-millennium Europe. Now we're coming into a millennium. And analysts want to observe that whenever you come around a time of a millennium, there's this tremendous religious fervor that starts to get going. And these feelings about the end of the world. The end of the world is coming, and so everyone finds a kind of spirituality or some way to understand what's coming. Either to save their skins, to be one of the 350,000 elect who are going to get the rapture, or to anticipate a time when perhaps the apocalypse will bring the new creation, the second coming that Jesus promised. And so all of those forces were also at work at that time. Sometimes it was even kind of hysterical. I don't mean funny, although it could have been, but a religious hysteria, which on the one hand could give birth to the Inquisition, and on the other hand would give a certain desire on people's part to see miracles. They wanted a miracle. They wanted something outside of what appeared to be physical possibility. They wanted that to occur. And sometimes that longing for miracles would put itself into a fervent devotion to relics. Every church had its saint. Every church had its bones that people would come to have a cure. A miracle occur at. And it was, of course, a great profit for that local parish as well. Probably the single most important influence, I'll say on the Grail Myth. I don't know enough history to say on Europe at that time. I'll just say on the Grail Myth. The single most important influence was the Crusades. This was a period when they're in the midst of the Crusades, sort of trailing out of it. Certainly the ones, the Holy Land, which they had won and then promptly lost. It was real fast. They got it and they lost it. And we're sort of running back home to Europe and decided to launch a crusade on the Gnostics. But that's in Europe, but that's another story, and I'll get to that too. So let's just first we'll talk about the Crusades to the east. This was the time of the Crusade. And they went off to win their Holy Grail, which was Jerusalem. That was the religious impulse that was being touched. Underneath that, of course, were soldiers of fortune and people wanting to get booty and riches and wealth and all of that stuff too. But the spiritual impulse there was to win back the Holy Land from the pagans. That is, the Muslims, the people of Islam, who in fact, by our understanding of what pagan means now, weren't even pagans. They were believers in another faith. And guess what? That's what the Crusaders discovered when they got there. Certainly the elite of the Crusaders, which were the Knights Templars. The Knights Templars are a very interesting bunch. Has anybody ever heard of them before, the Knights Templars? The Knights Templars were begun by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, is that how we say it? Who was I think the founder, or at least associated with the abbot of the Cistercians. Was he the founder?
Founder.
So Saint Bernard was a reformer in the monastic tradition of the Cistercians, and at the same time founded these Knights Templars. And these knights were going to go off to Jerusalem and guard the road so that there could be safe passage between Europe and the Holy Land. And they put on the white robes. They had, the Knights Templars, the white robes of the Cistercian monks, but on it they had a red cross. These were warrior monks. Does that sound like a contradiction? Maybe, maybe not. They were warrior monks. And they were trained to be celibate, to be charitable, and to give their lives for, in the contemplative model, of a certain personal transformation that would bring us with their path toward God. They were an elite group, for sure. And it was this group that went to Jerusalem and were put into the temple there. It may have been the temple of Solomon. I'm sorry, I don't remember. It was important. But in fact, in some cases, it became a model of what the Grail Temple, how it would be described. don't remember, sorry. They, through the years, began to establish relationships with their enemies, the Moors, who they discovered to be highly cultured, highly educated, very spiritual, with lots of interesting ideas and ways of expressing their spirituality. They also discovered there things like astrology, numbers, science of numbers, the tarot, alchemy, and they, when they returned to Europe, brought all of that back with them. And it was at this time, either parallel to their return, or perhaps influenced by their return, and the return of others from the Holy Land, reporting what they had learned and what they had seen, that developing at that same time was a certain Gnostic experiment, especially in Southern Europe. The Cathars, the Albigensians. Now, Gnosticism, I'll try to define it. Others of you may know more about it. My understanding of it, and I'm not going to try to explain all of it, but basically Gnosticism is an affirmation of a personal experience of divine revelation. Gnosticism cut through the need for a priestly intervention. Now, there's more to it than that. And when the little bit I've read about them, there's some you could relate to, and some not, and there's that whether or not Jesus was really God or really man, and they don't think they believe he could be both, things like that. But more important than that, the specifics of it, was their insistence on a personal relationship and access to the divine without the church. The Gnostics, I had access, we don't know if it was direct access or through oral tradition, to what's known as the Apocrypha. That is, the books of Scripture that were never included in the canon. And they were never included in the canon because they did not serve the political purposes of the church that was forming in the year 300 and something when it had that council and decided exactly what the canon would be. So many of the books that didn't suit that purpose were excluded. But these Gnostics were able to study them, reclaim them, and were building an experiment in community and in spirituality and devotion that was based upon that. The church perceived this experiment as a threat. And it was. And it was. And so, when it failed winning the Holy Land and their Holy Grail in Jerusalem was gone, they decided to get another crusade going, and they could just go down there and get rid of the Cathars and the Albigensians. They did that. It was bloody, and it was a slaughter. There was kind of inquisitions and fire burnings and all of those kinds of things. And they basically, seemingly wiped them out. There are those who say that the Knights Templars moved on. And I lived in Portugal for a time, and it turns out that that was quite a stronghold. There are those who say that Henry the Navigator and those early explorers were, in fact, Knights Templars. And if you remember, if you think back to the pictures you've seen, the white cross and the cross, they were eventually eliminated there, apparently. And there are those who say that they then metamorphosed into what became the Masons. Some theories. The Masons of which our founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, were part of. That's just one theory. Don't take, that's not fact like the Knights Templars is fact. All right. Now, the church found this Gnostic experiment unacceptable. The thing is that this was a time when Europe could have gone in another direction, because even apart from that, you've got St. Francis with his revelation and his stigmata bleeding and his challenge to the church also in terms of the corruption of the wealth and all of that was going on. Speaking of wealth, by the way, the Knights Templars had become very wealthy in the East, and that was perhaps even another reason for the extinguishing of them, because the church benefits that as well. But St. Francis came, and he was another challenge to the church. They know that we were now passing into the age of the Holy Spirit. And in the age of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit spoke to the individual. And it was necessary to reject the church and the authority of the church in favor of the personal experience of the Spirit speaking. So there were all of these forces at work, and Europe could have gone in another direction, but the church was powerful. It didn't. It took St. Francis said, I think the word said what he said, and how many people have heard it. The things sort of got incorporated into structure as existed. But what did come through was the emerging primacy of the individual. There was a new psychological orientation toward the integrity and the sacredness of the individual soul and its ability to access spiritual truth. Essentially, the Grail myths are about this, their personal journey.
What was the thinking before that about?
That the community, that the institution, that authority, whether in the form of the church or the king, had primacy over my own individual experience and my own impulse and my own experience with God speaking to me, through me, in me. Now, Joseph Campbell has done some interesting work on this, and when he talks about the Grail and Power of Myth, somebody mentioned it. The simultaneous with all of this was the rising of the courts of love, the troubadours. And what emerged at this time was the concept of amour, love. Personal, romantic love, which was different from eros, which was basically lust, which was basically impersonal. It's like a biological response. Boom, you go. Different from eros, and different from agape, which was also, as beautiful as it was, impersonal. It's just a generalized love of humanity or of the community. Eros was one-to-one. Amour was one-to-one. And it did not need to have sex as part of it in order to exist. In fact, very often, the ideal of courtly love is that you wouldn't consummate it. You would love somebody who was not available to you. She was married, for example. That you would have a devotion to, it was acceptable, it was socially included, it just wouldn't be consummated sexually. And this was an acceptable form of expression. All the poems, all the troubadour songs were about this rise of amour. Why do you think they separated it out from sex? It didn't have to be, but it was, very often.
It wasn't just in France that this arose.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the rest of Europe.
Right. But it was in France that the Grail myth arose.
Right. And wasn't it always adultery?
Excuse me?
It was always adultery. I mean, the mistress was unattainable because she was taken.
Right. And very often by the king, somebody who was, you wouldn't want to betray. But it was important because it was one of the important factors in the Arthurian legends, in the Grail myths, which were ostensibly in Britain, which was a Lancelot and Guinevere story. All right, so here we got the force of love and amour and the rights of the individual. And it was like, something new was opening up. And into all of this, on the one hand, social chaos, on the other hand, this devotional fervor, this desire, this longing of union with the divine, which the amour was part of. This love would become a path toward union with the divine. Into all of this, and into these courts comes the Welsh bard, telling these magical, fantastical stories of fairies and shapeshifters and disappearing castles and other worlds that exist simultaneous with the physical world, and you can just sort of go through a mist and pass over into another world that's like a parallel universe. Sounds like Star Trek. So these came into these courts, and because that also combined with some of those Eastern influences which were coming in, and the mystical influences of the Sufi, and Rumi, the poet, in his devotion to the beloved as a spiritual path, was there also. And all of this came together and became the Grail Myth. I've given you some maps that will, you can take with you, and basically can help you understand this progression and this movement. Anybody doesn't have a map? It's a sheet of paper, two-sided. Oh, it is. These papers down. Thank you. So, see rat number 1, the Earl of Crazy. How do you say his name, Helen? Crazy-Anne. The movement out of Ireland into Wales, where the bards picked up on it, and as they migrated into Brittany, the emergence of George and Pierre with Crazy-Anne's version of the Grail, first version of the Grail which emerged. Map number 2 shows the circles of influence that were at work at that time. The largest, of course, was coming out of the Middle East and through the Crusades. Who would have thought? Because, of course, the Knights Templars were the example of the Grail Knight. Coming out of North Africa and up to the Iberian Peninsula, which is where those Cathar, now the Genzian communities live, was one of the influences. And then coming from the Celtic world. Again, also coming up at that time was the natural sciences, which in fact the Moors had in fact gone very far. And that information has been lost in the Dark Ages, and it was sort of being recaptured now through the Middle East. So the sciences were beginning to emerge at that time also, in addition to the occult sciences, pseudosciences, or maybe the sciences also. I'm going to stop there, all right? And if you want to do card changes and stuff like that, we'll take a little break. Now, a definition of the myth of the Holy Grail. What is the myth part? Yeah, the myth part. When I say myth, what do I mean by myth? It's not real, I would think. But this is the problem with the word myth. People think the word myth means story, not real, lie, fantasy.
Think of myth as fiction. Sometimes fiction can be a lot truer than fact. Because it goes beyond each archetype.
I would even say think of myth as poetry.
Yeah, right.
I would think of it as a larger underlying structure that may be unconscious, but that is the framework in which we're living or experiencing our lives.
And I would say a larger underlying truth.
Yeah.
Truth, a larger underlying truth or experience, as experience as a truth, and that is being brought out in
Or an expression of meaning.
Yeah.
through symbols, through imagery, through story, through characters. It's the enactment of some fundamental truth about human existence that may not be true in the sense that it actually happened, although it could have happened too, because something that's true can also be a myth.
or it may be that it didn't happen, but it's one way of explaining something. So that every culture has, for example, its cosmology. How did life begin? How did the world begin? And if you are part of that culture or that religion, you call that the truth. You call that your religion. If you come from outside of it, you would call it a myth. Meaning, you may not accept it as religion or as truth, but it speaks of a truth that's more important than the actual details. So for Native Americans, we are standing on Turtle Island. That's part of their cosmology. Well, in order to understand why they call it Turtle Island, we have to know what is the significance of the turtle, and what does it mean to be an island, and what is all of this suspended in? Does that mean we're in water? Does that mean that the turtle has come up out of the sea? We don't, there's a truth in there. For us, it's a myth. For them, it's truth. This is Turtle Island. If you were not of the Judeo-Christian tradition, you would look at the Bible and say, that's a nice myth. It speaks of a truth, but it may not have actually occurred in that way. But if you're in the religion, you say, this happened. In 7 days, God created the world. Well, someone outside that would say, well, 7 days is just a way of talking about a period of time in which something occurred. The myth, what you call myth, often depends on where you're standing in relation to it. And I hope that helps at all? No, that was great. Okay, good. That the Holy Grail may or may not have existed. That's one of the questions we're going to look at. Is there really a Holy Grail? Or is this just a way of symbolizing some greater truth? All right. I'm going to just read to you from this book, which I would say is the single most, for me, has been the single most valuable book. I wish I could say it was written by a woman, but it wasn't.
Does everybody have a copy of bibliography? If I can hand that out. Anybody need one?
And it's called The Holy Grail. Its origin, secrets, and meanings revealed.
Wow.
And it's by Malcolm Godwin. And it's got beautiful pictures all the way through. And it makes the myth and the stories and the implications of the social historical context, all of it accessible and rationally understandable. And at the same time touching that mythic, poetic dimension. So from this book, I would like to read to you how he would describe the basic story, acknowledging that it's really a hodgepodge, and depending upon who you're reading, you're going to get some variation on it. But what is the stream that seems to be running through all of them? The essential story appears to be set in an unspecified age of chivalry, associated with the court of King Arthur. Historically speaking, this would have been the 6th century, although most of the accounts show no more than a cursory regard for chronological accuracy. Often setting the action 5 centuries later during the Crusades. The field of the action is likewise found in regions set as far apart as Britain and the Holy Land, ranging over Wales, Scotland, Brittany, southern France, Germany, Spain, Egypt, India, and the Near East, depending upon which stories you're reading. Yet, while historical sites and locations are often given with a wealth of accurate detail, the reader must never lose sight of the fact that the real action takes place mostly within the dreamscape. This is like a dream. Mostly within the dreamscape of the other world. Other world, O, capital O. And far removed from historical time. Into this bardic and mythical place, a hero is born, who is destined to achieve his quest for a mysterious otherworldly object known as the Grail. At this point, you should know the Grail isn't just a cup. In lots of the stories, it is a cup. But sometimes it's a cauldron. It's an object that just shines, and you don't even find out what it actually is. It can be a dish. It can be a stone. It's come down to us as a cup. But in the stories, it isn't always. And this has certain implications as well, which I'll talk about. So this hero is variously known as Arthur, Gawain, Peredur, Roosevelt, Parsifal, Galahad, or Bors. There are many different Grail heroes depending on the story. His conception, meaning his birth, is usually the result of a mysterious conjunction of parents possessing a mixture of the highest valor and virginal purity, or the most potent magical and spiritual powers. As a child, he is reared alone, without companions or siblings. Either, and this is very interesting, he is raised either by his mother or by magically endowed warrior women, or by nuns.
That word warrior or warrior?
Warrior.
Okay.
What did I put here?
Warrior.
That would have been me. I would have been the mother. And that's warrior with the personality. Thus, while he often lacks any worldly ways, he has an innocence which in some cases earns him the name the Great Fool. The Great Fool. In case I forget, and in case there's the Christian Holy Fool. The Holy Fool. And in the Tarot, if anybody here knows the Tarot, there is also, the first card in the Tarot is the Fool. The Tarot, it's connected with that also. When he eventually leaves this female domain, his first desire is to become the greatest knight of his age. He enters the world of men. This entails an initiation through the court of King Arthur and joining the fellowship of the Round Table. Round Table. Circles. We're going to come back to circles and the Round Table. It's very important. At this point, although the hero distinguishes himself mightily, revealing the telltale mark of destiny, he is always seen as a bit of a gawky yet handsome misfit in the chivalrous company of his fellow knights. His renown through prodigious feats of arms, his impeccable family pedigree, and that lineage is very important in the myth, and I'm going to talk about that, were such fated acts as taking his place at the Round Table on the seat perilous, mark him clearly as the chosen one. The seat perilous at the Round Table. The Round Table was actually, especially in the Christian version of the myth, the Round Table was the third table. The first table was the table of the Last Supper. The second table was the table established for the Holy Grail by Joseph of Arimathea. I'll talk about that. And the third table was the Round Table, at which the Grail appeared. And at this table, which was all the knights, King Arthur's knights would gather around the Round Table, and the significance of that was that there was not that kind of hierarchy, that everybody was equal at the table. There was one seat that was kept empty, and this was the seat that signified where Judas had been, at the table of the Last Supper. And it was destined that he who would be worthy enough
to attain the Holy Grail would be the only person who would be able to sit and fill that seat again. And anyone who tried, who was not having that destiny, the seat would break, it would crack, or it would swallow it up and just like disappear into the sea. So that's the seat perilous, meaning it's very perilous to sit in there if you are not meant to be there, if you are not the chosen one. All right, so he takes his place in the seat perilous. Then either he rides off to discover the mysterious Holy Grail by himself, or it appears at Arthur's table, giving off such a miraculous and nourishing aura that when it vanishes, all the assembled knights vow a fellowship and quest to discover its secret. The stories then follow the moralizing preferences of the individual author, describing both those perfect knights who will eventually achieve the mystery and those who for some reason are flawed and fail. The unfolding story is one of a dreamlike journey into the unknown through the agency of the sacred and mysterious vessel. But the search is individual, and the seeker, thus the importance of this ride in the age of individual and individuality. It's not going to be a spiritual journey through the church or through community, but it's me and my God. The search is individual, and the seeker has to face the void alone in order to earn the right to a direct communion with the ultimate mystery. The initiate hero must variously ask a question correctly, avenge a wrong, win the Grail, remain steadfast and loyal, or capture a castle to prove himself worthy.
Say them again.
Yeah, these are the various things he might have to do, depending upon the story. He must either, and usually he does have to ask a question correctly. He has to ask the right question. We're going to talk about all these things, okay? I'm just giving you the overview. He might have to avenge a wrong, win the Grail, remain steadfast and loyal, or capture a castle to prove worthy. The importance of the castle we'll talk about. By doing so, he is transformed, and through his actions manages to heal the wounded guardian, known as the wounded king or the fisher king. He manages, through his actions, to heal the wounded guardian of the sacred vessel and restore the surrounding wasteland to a paradise. That's the basic story. And all of them have variations on that, containing most, but not necessarily all of those elements. This is the story. I love little drawing schemes. There's one other schema to look at. You see how this basically follows. Although this paradise piece up here, I didn't, it wasn't in there, his description, but it's very important. And of course, the attainment brings you back to paradise also. You start in paradise, you go back to paradise. But before doing that, I'd like you to refer to the other side of the map, which talks about the three streams of the Grail myth. The three streams, culturally and spiritually, in which it emerged. It's nice, it's in the shape of a cup. Also, some might say the tree of life, Kabbalistic tree of life. The ball is very important in this. All of the esoteric religions play a part. I mentioned that the beginnings of it we find in the Celtic world. So the first stream, and Chrétien de Troyes was connected with this, comes from the Celts. His story is really a telling of that story. He really doesn't have that many Christian influences within it. It's sort of there, but really he's telling a Celtic story. So much so that it wasn't even really the Holy Grail that much in his story. But the idea of a Holy Grail really didn't emerge at that point. It was only when it was taken over by the Cistercians and Christianized, and others who were part of that, like Robert de Boron, took these Celtic symbols and these traces of Celtic legends and stories and somehow managed, we'll see some of the traces of it, to turn them into Christian symbols. And turn it into the relationship with Christ and the Grail Might and the manifestation of Christ. They did all of that. It was at that point that it became the Holy Grail. That's the Christian stream. And then the other stream here called the chemical branch. I usually say alchemical just to distinguish between that and chemistry. But it's really about alchemy. And that came from Germany. There's really only one story within that, and that is Eschenbach's Wolfram story. And that is the story that has most apparent within it its influence from the religions of the Orient, as well as these new occult and esoteric religions, like astrology and Buddhist and tarot and things like that. All right, so we've got the Celts, the Christians, and the alchemy, the alchemists. Now, whatever stream the stories, I'm going to follow them through. These are some of the variations. Not all of them. I can't tell everything. I don't know everything, and I can't even tell what I do know, all of it. I'm going to try to do it with pull out some of the highlights in a way that's understandable. All of them begin with a preface that tells where this object came from, what it was and where it came from. And where it came from in all of these streams was a time when there was a paradise. A time when all was in balance and whole. When there was fruitfulness and abundance. A time without suffering as we have come to know it in our world today. That's why I ended up with the circle and the light. We all began in that circle that was not yet broken. Now, in the Celtic version of this paradise, this is so interesting. Detroit wrote the Elucidation, as well as his comments to Grail. And the Elucidation tells you about where the Grail came from. And it came from a time in Britain when the king existed in a right relationship with what was called sovereignty, meaning the goddess, meaning the land. They would use it. At that time, the king could not rule without being in right relationship with the land and the goddess and the female principle. So the Myth of Babylon is, such a good book to read because it really shows this. So much so, and we know this, that there was a whole ritual life that repeated itself in the cycles of the year, because also among the Celts, and this is an important thing about time and the myth, there was no linear time. It was all cyclic time, based upon the seasons. Things grow, they come into fruition, they wither, they die, they come back again, they grow, they wither, they die. and that there were rituals connected with keeping this cycle of fertility going. And they involved playing out this union of the king with sovereignty, the goddess. This paradise was called Logrish, L-O-G-R-E-S. And Logrish was the place where the women kept the sacred waters, the sacred wells. They were the keepers of the wells. And the men would come, the knights, the kings, and they would drink from the waters that the women would give them in their sacred vessels. And the men would come and drink from these waters, and by doing so, they could gain access to the other world. We would call it the spirit world. For them, it wasn't about spirits. It was all part of the same natural universe. They didn't make the distinction between spirit and matter. You could cross back and forth. That's why the Holy Grail wouldn't be part of their myth, because it's all holy, or it's all not holy. It's all part of the same thing. Nature is holy, and holy is nature, and the spirit is the physical, and the physical is spirit. What time is this? The Celtic scholars. When was the Celtic? I would say
2000 BC, something like that. Really ancient.
So there's a memory of this time built into the myth. And this balance, this wholeness, this ensured fertility and abundance and peace of the land was built into the balance of the male and the female principle. The king and the goddess, and sovereignty, and her earthly representatives, which were the ladies of the well. Male principle, the male force, political power could not be exercised without her dominion. Okay. So what happens? One day, this one king decides he doesn't really like this arrangement. Here comes the fall. And he decides, we got to put a stop to this. I'm going to claim this for myself. Rapes the women. He doesn't singly rape all of them. He's got his men involved in this, the whole bunch of them. They come in one day and they rape the women, violate them, and steal the sacred vessel. That is the Holy Grail.
That the waters were in? The vessel that the waters were in.
The kingdom at that point is disrupted. The men can no longer gain access to the other world, which they absolutely need in order to remain in right relationship with the land and the physical universe. So out comes the wasteland. No longer were the cycles ensured. No longer was it possible to count on the balance and the wholeness which is once there. And so in this tradition, the hero is really the one who is going to somehow, through proving himself worthy, find his way back to the other world and reconcile. Kingship, again, with the goddess. You see, people think it's a story about knights going out to find this cup. And why would a women's movement, for example, like the Grail, take its name off of the story about these guys, dressed up in armor and swords and all this stuff going out to find a cup? What does that have to do with us? What it has to do with us is that the irony is that these guys are all dressed up in armor and ready to do battle in order to find their feminine selves. They're in search of the divine feminine. That's what the cup is. Look at her. There she is. She is the container, the vessel that we've all come from. so they're all dressed up to do battle, to find something that no battle can ever get.
Amen.
And then part of their path toward reconciliation is discovering that they don't need the armor, that there's something else that's going to get it for them. That the code of chivalry and knighthood, in fact, isn't going to get them very far. Something else is being added. And that's their path. As we said, the hero, that's where the story begins. You see, this is the backdrop. The crazy end is the elucidation. Now we're on to the story. And the story is personal. Raised by his mother. Father was killed in battle, so were the brothers. The mother was determined, this boy is never going to see those guys, those knights, I'm going to keep him, I'm going to protect him, I'm going to keep him in my world. Echoes of that earlier era, where the women, it was the women's world, echoes of that. One day, through the forest come the knights, shining armor. The guy wants to go. He's got to go. I got to go, Mom. You've been great, but I got to go. And he leaves his mother in a swoon of grief. He doesn't mean to hurt her, but he's just got to go. So he does. And he finds his way into a series of adventures, eventually to the Round Table. That's the journey. He goes off on his journey. She dresses him in funny clothes, though, so he looks like a fool, but it doesn't work. He eventually ends up in Arthur's court. And there's all of this need amongst the knights to get back to the other world, to find the Grail again in order to do away with the wasteland, which in fact they must even come upon in order to find the Grail itself. So that he sets out again and crosses at that point. That's why I've got this in a circle here. He crosses into that other world. It's another dimension. And it's very hard to explain, except to maybe think of it as a dream world. The same way we go into dreams at night. Anything can happen in there. And a lot of what you find in there when the knight is in there, once again, how this is a female story, are all these women appearing to him and telling him things and harassing him and mocking him when he's being a fool, when he's not learning the lesson, trying to help him to transform himself enough that he can ultimately really pass over and bring everything back into balance again. So he's out there in the wasteland and eventually comes upon a castle in the midst of it all. And he enters the castle. And a whole series of mysterious things goes on. There's a wounded king. The wounded king always has a genital wound. Always. His wound is in the thigh. It is clearly a genital wound that has interfered with his ability to be sexual. And it is a wound that cannot be healed until this knight does what is necessary to help that to happen. And the king's wound and the wasteland are simultaneous. They're connected. When the king is healed of his wound, the land will be healed and made fertile again. So he comes into the castle. Everybody's really nice. There's the king. And all of a sudden, stuff starts to happen. What happens is what's called, and appears in most of the stories, the Grail procession. Here comes the Grail. Here comes the Grail. Watch out, folks. Here comes the Grail. But it appears in a very strange way. First you've got a sword, dripping with blood. And you've got candle holders, and then the entrance of a spear, also with blood. And a dish, sometimes with a head on it, a bloody head. Sometimes, not always, sometimes. especially in the Celtic version. That's where you see the head, because that's a reference back to an earlier story of the Celts about this king that was cut off, and he could prophesy that way, and he went with all his knights to the other world, and they spent 80 years together prophesying. That's another great Celtic story. But that's what the head is. And then, of course, the Grail, which in Great the End is not necessarily defined as a cup. It's a shining object. It's a vessel of some kind. And it is being carried, and the vessel is always carried by a woman, the Grail Maiden. The goddess in her virgin aspect, in her maiden aspect. The goddess has three phases: the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And in the Grail myth, she's always appearing or disappearing in one of these many aspects. When she's out to harass him, she's the crone. She's a hag, and she likes it that way.
But isn't the crown also supposed to be the very epitome of wisdom?
Yes, that's it. And that's why she's the one who harasses him, because she's wise and has the wisdom to do so. But the cup, the Grail, is always carried by the Grail Maiden, never carried by a man. Why? Because she is a cup of wine. Entrancing thing, this cup. It's full of light, aromas, and food appears, especially in the Celts. The Celtic thing is really about the food. All the food ends up on your plate. Whatever you like to eat best, that's what's there. References also to the cornucopia, the horn of plenty. And just a sense of bliss and joy and all of that. But meanwhile, you've got this suffering king going on at the same time, and often the sounds of women weeping. You don't see them, but the sounds of all these women weeping. Now, this is the test. At this point, the knight is supposed to ask the right question. In Great the End, at this point, it's really, and this is the most enigmatic of the questions. Who does the Grail serve? Now, I don't know, it might be about the food, like who really got the best food. I don't know. But who does the Grail serve? It could be more than that. But the other question that also comes up is to the king. And it is, what ails thee? Why do you suffer? This is a question of compassion. Not the armor, not the chivalry, not the normally thought of heroic bravura. That's not what gets it. What gets it is a simple question of compassion. What ails thee? But he doesn't ask the question. He thinks the question. He thinks the question. He has the impulse. But he doesn't ask it. And do you know why he doesn't ask it? Because, I'll tell you, because when he left his mother and he went into the world of men and learned their codes and their laws and their ways of behavior, what do you think one of the first things he learned was? Don't ask questions. And let's not get into the one about the difference when men and women are lost in their car and what they do, right? Don't talk too much and don't ask questions. He was being a good knight. So that right back there, even in the Celtic version, there was something about getting off of the social codes, the cultural limitations, and going beyond them. That was being asked of the true hero. So he doesn't ask the question. He has a great knight, though. great night, and sleeps very chastely with one of the may have been the Grail Maiden, I'm not sure, but one of the young women of the castle. They have a nice night, very loving, falls in love with her even. He wakes up in the morning and everyone's gone. He didn't ask the question. Everyone's gone. Castle's empty, no more grill, no more nothing, no more procession. And as he's leaving, he's going up the ramp to gallop out, and even as he's leaving, the thing is coming up and gotta jump over. Things closed, gone. No more castle. Disappeared. These things can happen in the other world. See, he had passed into it, and now he was out of it. But what he finds out there is a young woman, once again. I don't remember if it was the maid or the woman he was with the night before, but she says, "You're really a fool. You were supposed to ask the question, and you didn't do it." So now he's got to wander around for another period of time. And he has had more adventures, which eventually purify and build up his character. He learns the lessons. He meets a hermit. He studies. He does penance. He does various things. And eventually finds his way back again to the other world, to the castle, comes in and says, "What ails thee, uncle?" King is healed, or in some cases he dies because really Parsifal is now going to replace him. The land is healed, all is well. But in the Celtic version, that's just part of the cycle. You go back and it starts all over again. Because life is cyclical. In the Celtic version, the Grail is never completely attained. It's really about the cycle. There is a theory, and it's by Jessie Weston, and I put her on your bibliography. She emerged in the early part of the century, and when T.S. Eliot was writing The Wasteland, if you ever look at the notes, if you get through the poem and look at the notes, just about all of his references are to J. Weston, J. Weston, J. Weston. Here's what she said. She says that the Grail is really a narrative report on what was once an initiation rite. That the symbols, the stories of the Grail is really a remnant from what was once an actual initiation, and that's the importance of the Grail procession and the things that come out of it. All of these things were related to that original ritual. And that turned into story that went into the repertoire of the Welsh bards, which ended up in France and all of that. But really, it was a ritual. And these are remnants. And to notice that these are called the four hallowed, the four holy objects. The Grail really is part of these four holy objects. The sword, the spear, the dish, and the Grail itself. Once again, the four suits of the Tarot. The cup, the pentacle, which is in a dish, the spear, which has leaves growing from it, and the sword. These two, the sword and the spear, guess what they symbolize? The male principle, and the dish, which is also the circle, the female. So it's the presence of both the male and the female principle. And they're all associated with blood. They're all associated with blood. Blood, which is life. And interestingly, when we get to the Christian version, blood that then becomes associated with whose blood? Jesus Christ. In the Christian version, the Holy Grail is the vessel containing the blood of Christ that was caught by Joseph of Arimathea at the time of the crucifixion. And he got it, and he saved it, and he put it on an altar in his house, and the Romans found out about it and put it in jail. Huh? Well, I don't know if they stole it or not. He had family. But God and Jesus appeared to him and helped him to get out of jail magically, like the way the castle disappears, the jail walls are gone. And he was told to take that cup and your family to England. Go there, to England. Get me on a boat to Glastonbury tour. So in the Christian version, we know the paradise, of course, was the original paradise. We know that story. We know that story of the fall. But then Jesus will somehow bring us back to that paradise and reconciling us to the sin of who? Eve. Eve. Once again, this thing about the usurpation of women and their primacy. Always, when there's a fall, the sacred object, the Grail cup, lands in the hands of those who become the Grail guardians. And this cup, this vessel, is passed down through the generations, through a bloodline. So that the hero is part of that bloodline, though he may not know it in the beginning. It becomes revealed as it goes on. Bloodline. So Joseph took the cup and his family through a series of adventures, ends up finally in England, where he establishes the Church of Mary. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, one of the historical forces at the time was the rise of the cult of Mary. Mary had not been a very big deal until then. But simultaneously with the rise of war and the courts of love and a renewed reclaiming of the feminine, which the Grail also represented, comes Mary, which the Orthodox Church at that time also tried to suppress but was not successful. Especially where? In the South, which is where the Gnostic experiments were, but that's, I'm just imagining there might be a connection there, I don't know. So he establishes a church in honor of Mary, who was always associated with the rose, at Glastonbury, Tours, which was supposedly the site of Avalon, and where that passing over could occur. This is like when you go to Europe and you go to a church and you find out that under this church was built an earlier church, and under that church was built a pagan site, or no, first a Roman site, and then under that site was a pagan site. And there's just these layers. They're all in the same place. They're built on top of each other.
The church was built on top.
Well, it was built in the same place where, first of all, the sacred wells were, and there's still the water, the Glastonbury, which a dear friend brought back to me in a little while. And it was also the place where Avalon existed in a parallel universe with the church that was built in Glastonbury. They were like occupying the same space. This is what I'm saying. It's like they're dimensions, and they're simultaneously occupying the same space, but in a different time zone that overlaps and then spins out. So that's that whole story on the fall, the Grail Guardians, and the Christian version. Now, here come the heroes. There are many streams of the Christian version. I will talk about the Cistercian because it's the most quintessential of the Christian version. It really points to the difference in the tendencies in that. All of the others, like Percival, this fool who comes into consciousness and does terrible things, he doesn't mean to, but he does. It's about growing into consciousness, about his wrongdoing, his limitations, and growing and becoming more whole. Okay. But the Cistercians decided we need a new hero, because our hero's got to be perfect. And he's perfect right from the beginning. And that was Galahad. He was the one raised by the nuns. Three nuns, number three. I have Trinity and all that stuff. Three nuns, three aspects of the God. You see a certain synchronicity among all these different things. You could just, like their threads, just unravel and follow through. All right, he's raised by the three nuns. And he's perfect. Now, one of the main reasons he's perfect is...
Slap those hands with a ruler.
No. Only the perfect nun. What? The Knights Templar gave it up, Helen, and they were a model for the Christian knights. And the knights who would pursue the Grail in the Christian myth were asked, and being asked, to be chaste. Because that was one of the primary values of Bernard. Chaste, charity, to be charitable toward all, even your enemies, and to really do that. And grace, to believe in grace and to be open to it.
And they took vows to remain that way.
Well, some of them did, some of them did. For example, Gawain, who in all of the versions is a very earthy, sensual guy. You know, at one point he was confronted by one of the characters, might have been one of the women or one of the hermits. He said, you know, you're not going to get there if you keep this up, as he insisted on, you know, having women. He said, yep, you're right, you know me. He wouldn't change. But then there's Lancelot. Now it turns out, guess what? Galahad is Lancelot's son. Lancelot, who has sinned with Guinevere. Double sin. First of all, lust, seemingly. I mean, he broke through the call of chastity, but also betrayed his king. And one of those nights when he thought he was with Guinevere, something happened, a little trick played on him, and he wasn't. Really, he was with the daughter of the wounded king. Things happen. Stuff happened, and it was dark. So somehow the daughter of the wounded king ended up where Guinevere was. Might have been in the forest, who knows. And she conceived Galahad. Who was then taken and raised by these three nuns. And finally appears in the very beginning in the season of Pentecost. Pentecost is very important in the Christian myth. That's when the knights come together. Pentecost is the time when the Spirit appears in tongues of fire and calls you out to your mission and your quest and all that stuff. So we all get together in Pentecost. Red was also the color of that time, also the color of blood. And it's at the season of Pentecost that the nuns bring Galahad to Lancelot to be knighted. He doesn't know his son. He is knighted and then appears at court on Pentecost Sunday, sits in the perilous seat, is not swallowed, doesn't cause a big bang of splitting. He's the one. And it's on that very day that the Grail appears in all its light and calls all the knights forward to search for her. And effectively ends the Fellowship of the Round Table, which now becomes the Fellowship of the Grail. So in fact, the appearance of the Grail is the beginning of the end of Arthur's table and Arthur's kingdom. It was now passing on to a higher community. But of course they would all set out alone. So Galahad goes out, but Percival goes also. Bors goes, Gawain goes, Lancelot goes, they all go. And they say, Gawain isn't making it. But he's finding another castle, the castle of marbles, that has all these women in it. And he's come to liberate them. And he does that, and he's happy, and it's a good thing. But it's not as high as finding the Grail. It's a good thing. These women who are being held prisoner in a castle and need the knight to come is a reference back to the earlier Celtic Logrish and all these women who need to, that their knights must reconcile themselves with. Okay. So he's out of the running. Lancelot, who has been very sinful, very bad, discovers that he's being stopped because of that. And he chooses, unlike Gawain, he chooses to try to rectify his ways. He goes into a time of period of penance and fasting and abstinence and study with a hermit. Puts on the hair shirt. Trying to find some way to get there, to reconcile himself with his own past and his own sins. I'm telling you in the eyes of the Christian version. Finally gets to the cabinet. He does. He gets to the doorway, but he can't get in. But through the doorway, he can see what is not a procession in the Christian, not in the Cistercian version anyway. It's a mass. Somehow the Grail procession and the Grail celebration is turned into the Holy Mass. So it's a mass going on. There is a sword, bloody sword. There are the candles and the spear. There's the dish, of course, of the host and the cup. 4 hollows are there. But he can't get in. And as the priest is holding up the host, what appears is a figure, probably the figure of Jesus, bearing down on it. It was so heavy, and the priest was like, couldn't bear the weight of it. And seeing that, Lancelot became so moved to try to help him that he was trying to break through. And we don't see him breaking through, but what does happen is he is shot through with lightning, burning on fire, and then when he wakes up, he's inside. What's interesting in the Cistercian version, neither Lancelot or Percival, who also gets there in his own way, or certainly Galahad, nobody ever has to ask a right question. There is no question in the Cistercian version that needs to be asked. But interestingly enough, Lancelot was moved by compassion, and it was that movement in compassion that got him through. Galahad never seems to have to do anything. He was born perfect, he lives perfect, and he gets to the Holy Grail, and like he sort of goes up in a blaze of ecstasy and he ascends into heaven, because really Galahad's supposed to be Christ. And all that he goes through in the story really shows this is the new Christ. Now here's something to understand, even as we see the limitations and what this is about, and women hating, it's clear evidence of it. If not hating, at least trying to alienate and trying to usurp. Because there is no Grail Maiden in this holy man. It's the priest who has now usurped the place of the Grail Maiden. But this is something to understand. Even this version is heretical. The whole Christian stream of the Grail was also heretical. It was also threatening to Mother Church. Because it was a mysticism that completely bypassed the apostles. It completely bypassed the lineage of the disciples, who were the founders and the lineage that gave birth to the church, which was supposed to be the authority. And there's a mysticism and a spiritual path that came through Joseph of Arimathea and his family that found this cup. Took this cup from the Last Supper, which was really the major teaching of Christianity, what happened at that supper. The church never fully accepted and recognized the Grail stories. It was always somewhere out there on the fringe, but for whatever reason, could not suppress it, may not even perceive all that was going on. It was so close to ritual. But that Christian version was also challenging the authority of the church, because it was still talking about personal path to divine revelation. Finally, there's the alchemical version. This is probably the one, once we are sufficiently entranced by the Celtic roots, this is probably the version that would be most interesting to us today. It comes from one person, Wolfram, in Germany, same period of time. And also follows the theme of paradise. Here's here's where the Grail came from in Wolfram's version. Very interesting. The Grail started out as a stone. And it was a stone in Lucifer's crown. Lucifer, which means light. It was a stone in the crown of Lucifer. And it fell out of his crown during the time of the battle in heaven between Lucifer and the other angels. Now, what was this battle about? That's what that sister told you back in Revelation. All right, try this one. The reason Lucifer rebelled was simultaneously with the creation of Adam and Eve. And God said, all of my angels will bow down and worship this new creation. Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve. Which God had placed above the angels. Now, it comes down instead of pride. No, I'm not going to worship man. No. According to Eschenbach and his Oriental sources, the reason Lucifer wouldn't bow down to Adam and Eve was because he loved God so much that he couldn't bow down to any other. So a battle ensues, and you've got 1/3 of the angels with Lucifer. 1/3 of the angels with God. And then there's 1/3 of the angels that are neutral. They didn't go on either side. And when that stone fell out of Lucifer's crown, they caught it and they brought it down to earth. And that's the Grail in the alchemical version. Turns into a vessel, but not before it's a stone and reminiscent of the philosopher's stone, which is key to the alchemical path. You find the philosopher's stone and you can turn raw metals into gold, which is a whole path of refinement, which is understood as a spiritual journey of refinement of the soul into the highest, into gold, into immortality. It is an emerald also, it's green. Look at the power of fertility of the earth. Okay, so the stone comes down. This is paradise and the fall. Our hero emerges. Percival, once again. Basically the same story. Raised with his mother, who was afraid he was going to die like a father. Here's an interesting little twist, though. This father, who was in the lineage of the Grail Guardian, this father was a crusader in the Middle East. And he met a woman there. She was a black woman. And they gave birth to a child. And their child is black and white. Like the magpie, which is the bird that features very early in the story. The father, of course, is not very loyal, so the Crusades are over. He's gone. Goes back to Europe, marries another woman, gives birth to another child. And who is the second child? Percival. He gets in all of his battles, he's dead. Mother tries to protect the son. Percival does not know he has a brother who is a Muslim, a black Muslim, or a mulatto Muslim. Mixed of both black and white. The images of the story also begin right off, the dark and the light. And the idea is that nothing is pure. Right off, it's about no matter what you do, there will be good consequences and bad consequences. And all that you can do is keep moving toward the light. At one point, and this is really Percival's question throughout, independent of the right question, from the very time he's back with his mother, he says to his mother, "Mother, what is God?" His mother answers, "God is a light brighter than the sun, and the brightest summer day." That's all. God is a light. So you just keep moving towards that light, knowing that nothing is pure. And you try to walk the middle way. Perceval means to pierce the valley, to go between the two mountains. You walk the middle way. The neutral angels bring it down through the middle. The Grail comes through the middle. This is very akin to the Tao, T-A-O, the Tao. He is very influenced by those Oriental meditation religions. So once again, the hero sets off. His mother, though he doesn't know it, behind him, dying of grief. She dies from the grief of his going, which, by the way, saves the other Percival also. It's much later as he goes through his journey of purification that one of the reasons that provokes him is discovering that he has killed his mother. But here's the paradox. Here's the dark and the light. He has to go. He must go. He should go. This is his path. But at the same time, his mother dies. Built into the journey in the third version, the alchemical version, is the search for truth and higher consciousness. That's the real focus. And things like that. And the third is really about coming into consciousness and truth. The story follows pretty much the same pattern as Chrétien, except that there's a way of following it in which we're constantly brought back to the idea of surrender and letting go. In this story, what emerges is that the knight, Percival, does not get to the Grail through his own will and his own striving. Over and over again, he lets go of the reins of the horse. And it is the horse, it is nature, that takes him to the Grail. So while in the Celtic version, there's nothing to distinguish between holy and nature. And in the Christian version, you've got very clear lines drawn between nature and the holy, and that's why you look at the Holy Grail. In the alchemical version, nature and spirit also become one, but acknowledging that they are not necessarily the same. And God, the divine, becomes immanent in all of nature. And it is the job of the hero to let himself go to it. The Christian would never let go of the horse because you never know where it's going to take you. You always got to hold on to the reins. It could take you to someplace bad. In the alchemical version, there's no bad, there is no good. It's just going on more and more toward the light. Just consciousness and truth. Now, the way this story ends, through the attainment, here's what happens. He goes through all of the stuff, doesn't ask the right question, out there in the quest again, and one day he comes upon this knight, who he ends up in a fight with him. And guess who it is? It's brother. It's his brother. It's his brother. And in the course of the fight, his sword breaks. The sword always breaks on these guys. The sword breaks, and then it's put back together again, it breaks it back together again, which is an interesting phenomenon. So the sword breaks. And this was the moment when the other knight, they don't know their brother, could have killed him, but he doesn't. This would not be fair. Throws away his sword. They sit down, they start talking. Telling stories about their father. And guess what? They figure out, hey, we are brothers. We're brothers. So they can walk together back to the court, They start to journey together, and they're sent out once again, now this time to really find the Grail, and they do it. They go there together. He and his Moorish, half-black, half-white brother, together, end up in the Grail Castle. He asks the right question. His brother, Fearfish, that's the person of fish, I don't know, falls in love with the Grail Maiden, the carrier, the bearer of the Grail. He falls in love with her. First of all, he was already married to one of the maidens who he's been missing all that time. But Fearfish falls in love with the Grail Maiden, and he is so taken by that love, well, it's still Christian, right? He's willing to be baptized. He's willing to be baptized. And he does. And when he does that, the Grail appears. You've got this rhapsodic moment of everything coming together, and it starts to glow, and inside the Grail, words appear. There are words inside. And the words say, what do you think would be written inside the Grail cup? The Grail cup suddenly appeared in this blaze of light and ecstasy, and there were words inside. What would the words say?
Drink is it.
This is it? Drink me?
Is that all there is?
Is that all there is? But this is what it says. If any Templar of the community should, by the grace of God, become ruler of a foreign peoples, let him ensure that they are given their rights.
Whoa.
Justice. So, Fearfish, the brother, the Moorish, now Christian, part Moorish, part Christian brother, and the Grail Maiden, with the Grail cup, leave the castle, go to India, I believe. They go east again, together. First of all, now becomes the guardian of the land there. Everything was looking fertility. Interesting. Who marries the Grail Maiden? Who goes with the Grail cup? Not Percival. His brother, who was black and white. Who was the Moor? Becomes now, with the Grail Maiden, the guardian of the cup. So they go back east, and they give birth to a child, and that child is Prester John. I don't know if any of you know about Prester John. But he became a mythical symbol of Christ, who was supposedly in the northwest coast of Africa, or India, and he had this kingdom that was supposed to be a paradise, and everyone was trying to find it, including the Portuguese, when they set out on their great explorations, led by Henry the Navigator, who was supposedly a Knights Templar, and all of those guys, and now they're looking for Prester John. One big happy family. Amazing. And that's how that story ends. Now there's just one more theory I want to tell you about, and then we can have lunch. I told you about the ritual here. That's important. I'm going to refer back to that this afternoon. The ritual means the soul ritual. Someone says it's really a rite of initiation as told by somebody outside of it. There is a book called Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. I read it, or most of it. Very strange book. From the bibliography. I don't refer to it throughout. I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to know about. But I don't include it because it's really not about myth. It really literalizes the Grail. There's a definite Grail. And all of these events are not stories, they're not mythical, they're not poetic, they're not symbolic, they're real. That's not as much fun. But this is what he says. It's interesting. It's not fun, but it's interesting. Okay. Rise of the cult of Mary and the Virgin Mary, the Mary being associated with the Grail. They got it all documented. The Mary in this theory of the Holy Grail is Mary Magdalene. And this is what they say, that Jesus and Mary did it. That they were in fact married. Legally or not, we don't. But that they were a couple. And that Mary conceived a child. So that when Jesus died, and that whole bunch was in exile, leaving Jerusalem, including Joseph of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene was one of them. And she gave birth to that child, and that child is in the lineage and the son of Jesus Christ. And that is the Holy Grail. And that lineage of Christ has been passed on right down to today. There are those who say they're part of that lineage of Jesus Christ. And that this was in fact connected with the Cathar and Albigensian experiment and the whole cult there. And that the Grail that was being kept was this bloodline of Christ.
Who was that book?
Was that supposed to be the Albigensian?
Whose theory is that? What's the
These guys, what are the names? Now the book came out in 1982. You've read it, Helen?
Yeah.
It's very weird, but it's very documented, and it's an interesting thought. And they placed the Grail Castle in Montsalvage, which is in the Spanish Pyrenees, which was in fact the last stronghold of the Cathars. Supposedly, the story is that at the time of that last crusade, and when they were finally being exterminated, somebody escaped with the Grail. That is, whoever's in this bloodline of Christ. Now it's interesting only because there are those who say, and also with Wolfram's story, that really all of these symbols are really referring to some truth, some mystery that the Knights Templars brought back with them from Jerusalem. And that all of this is really about clues to this mystery that is so threatening to the church that they had to exterminate it, or try to exterminate it. So all of these things could refer back to that, and in that book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, they make those connections back. April?
Well, it occurs to me if there's actual real bloodline of Jesus Christ himself personally, the Pope is not very important.
Didn't they have a movie out a couple years ago similar to this with Jesus and Mary Magdalene and all that? We're told to boycott.
Right.
Oh, that's what I was
I don't remember the name of it.
It's all I read. Sure, we weren't supposed to see anything like that.
How interesting.
I never remember the name.
See, what comes through the Christian version, even as enlightened and heretical as it was, is still the need to somehow alienate, first of all, usurp the women, usurp the role of the women, eliminate the goddess, or only let her appear in the form of a virgin, that is, no sex, that the intimate connection between sexuality and the stronghold of patriarchy. So Jesus couldn't possibly have had sex. He couldn't have possibly had a child. That would have been honoring the woman too much. Even when Jesus was born, Mary never had sex.
Yes.
It was somehow implanted in there. By the Spirit, by the Father, who was the ultimate creator of life, which also usurps the woman's role in the creation of life. She was just the vessel that carried it. It wasn't even probably her genetic code.
So what's his genetic code?
Does that...
We got a bloodline. We got now a family next that we're not part of.
That's right.
All of this conspiracy. Right. Yeah. Right.
Okay, we're first Deborah and then April.
Go ahead.
That's right, she was just shouting.
Oh. Does that have anything to do with why priests are not allowed to marry?
It doesn't? Is that why celibacy and chastity and all of that is so important? Is that part of,
Till the 12th century.
huh?
The 10th century.
Yeah.
It only became a rule in the 10th
Right.
century.
Once again, as the church affirmed and consolidated its hegemony and its power in a certain way of authority and began to interpret the Gospels and everything in those lines. See, one of the things that the Grail is, even in the Christian version, it was really about how humanity could become like Christ. A human being could be another Christ. This is heresy. That really, and it's affirming, and all these stories affirm that this is a journey toward evolution into spiritual beingness that makes us one with God and makes us, in fact, a manifestation of God.
Isn't that what Christianity is all about?
Well, maybe there's a way we can understand that now, but then it wasn't supposed to be that way. These are the forces that existed at that time that have helped to get us to that place. So that in one of these apocryphal books, in the Gospel of St. Thomas, those who've probably heard of the Gospel of St. Thomas, huh? There's been a lot of, I would like to get that sometime and read it, but one of the things that he said, he who drinks, Jesus speaking, he who drinks from my mouth will become as I am, and I shall be he. They're the same. That you too can be a child of God. You too can be divine. Into that. What does this mean for me in my life and my journey? What does it mean for the journey of humanity on this planet? Can we perhaps understand it in that way also? It's always best to start with the personal, however, so we will begin there, but as anybody feels moved to branch out, that's fine. Now, there's a certain structure I want to follow. And it's basically certain themes that I extracted for the purposes of writing my own ritual piece around this. You're working with the themes and the archetypes and things like that. And I framed the piece within the idea of the circle and the light, which I would hope you could see the resonance between what is typically thought of as the chalice and the blade, right, which was a famous book that's come out over the last 100 years. And I was trying to take it to another level where we move the chalice out of the chalice but into the whole idea of the circle, which the cup is one manifestation of. So that the first theme was the light as the blade, certain resonance with the blade, but somehow more infusing than that, somehow happening at another level, which isn't the usual associations that we might have with the story. But yet with the same cup, with even greater power to penetrate and infuse. Right, so that's why I moved it out of the chalice and placed the circle of the light. And I framed it within that, so that the first theme would be just about the circle, and I'm going to each of these. And the next theme out of that I followed had to do with the journey, which will ultimately and inevitably, and has already many times, I'm sure, brought us into the wasteland. And once we're in that wasteland, we say to ourselves, what is this place? How did I get here? Why does this always happen to me? What do I do to get out of here? What next? Who can help me? What's going to fix this thing? What happens? We start asking questions. And we know that a major issue in the myth is this: what is the right question? So that a question like, why does this always happen to me, may in fact not be the right question. But it's probably not the right question. Unless underneath the question is, why does this happen to me, meaning, why do I always put myself in a situation like this? If I just start to understand I'm in a pattern here. Why does it always happen to me, means something's happening? Why do I always get myself into this? Might be a better question. the right one's going in another direction. So it's not just any old question if it's the right question. But once you're in the wasteland, that's the first response. It's like, what's going on here? So it brings you to the question, which hopefully can bring you to the right question. And out of that question will come the quest. Interesting, question and quest. Quest is different from a journey. Everybody's on a journey. You leave your mother's womb and boom, there you go, you're on the journey. You're out of the circle and you're on the journey. Doesn't matter where you go, you're still on a journey. And it's only through coming into the wasteland, ultimately, that unfortunately, perhaps there's a real mystical meaning to it through suffering, through an entering into powers of the worlds or both, or how both are connected, whatever, that will bring us to the question. So ultimately, it's on the quest, which is journey with purpose, journey with meaning, all. Journey that has focus. And if we are lucky, we're good. You decide if you need to have sex or not. But you could get to the light. Which we know is associated with the Grail and attainment of the Grail. But more than that, it's about the going toward the divine. So those are the major themes that I've extracted out of all of that for the purposes of creating this ritual. Now, when they asked me, excuse me, I was at Grailville to do this ritual. I thought, okay, that's a nice idea, but I hadn't made an immediate connection on how it might fit. And then as I was doing my research, and I read Jessie Weston, and her vegetation theory, and how that the Grail story is the narrative of what was once a ritual. And that, in fact, it was originally the women who were the keepers of this Grail, this cup. I said, well, that's kind of nice. And I got excited. And so I thought, well, the purpose of the ritual would perhaps be to contemporize this ritual of regeneration and renewal. And to bring the Grail home to the women again. Telling the story, but in the temple of the Grail, not the castle, but the temple of the Grail, where it originally was, when it was held by the women. And it seems to have worked. People have liked it. When they've come, and it's a participatory ritual. It opens up into recording interaction at certain points. We're going to do it again in Philadelphia, in March 8th and 15th. And we're hoping that some of you, if you might want to tell your friends to come to that. Philadelphia Grail is also doing a series of programs related to it, and there's various materials around here talking about that. One sheet in particular gives the whole series of programs. And the next one is going to be an art workshop, working with these Grail things, and what they might mean for you. Because this is the way I would like you to try to get into some of this material for yourself. And I'd like to go through them a little bit by bit, okay? Especially the circle thing. This is really rich for me. And okay. The first thing about the circle is that it is the basic form of life. All of life exists in the form of a spiral. That's the basic unit of life. Whether it's the genetic code or a galaxy, all things come back to the circle, very often in the form of a spiral. It was one of the earliest representations that we find, whether in stone or in cave walls, that the early people felt compelled to do these circles. You can go out in the Southwest or into other places in Europe, and you can see these circles that they felt the need to do. Those are some of the earliest drawings that we have. We know that the early peoples were agricultural once they began to settle down, and that their life was a cyclical one, which we talked about. The womb itself is the circle. Paradise the original paradise, didn't exist in linear time. Linear time is the outgrowth of having to get somewhere. When you're in paradise, you don't have to go anywhere. You're just following the round of beingness. And of course, the Grail cup falls within that.
Okay.
I'd like, if you will, just to take a moment and try to remember, if you can, the last time you felt like you didn't have to go anywhere. The last time you felt that you were in the circle. Does anybody have a memory of that? Helen, do you?
Most of the time, not going anywhere. I'm tired.
You feel complete?
Oh, well, now.
That's something else, right?
That's
something
putting
else.
you on the
That's
spot,
something else.
Sharon.
Yeah. Okay, you don't have to answer. Can you imagine what that would feel like, though, to be complete? To have a sense of wholeness? What would that feel like?
You can have moments, actually. You know, just, I mean, I can even think back of perhaps some moments sometimes. And oh God, do I sound holy. But you know something about prayer, and I'm not a very good prayerful person at all. But at the same time, when I'm in a liturgy or in, there can be that minute of being. Without knowing, I know after half an hour I have to get the car and I have to grade those papers and I have to, you know, but there are those floating, fleeting moments, I think, that, well, and I'm doing watercolor these days, and I'm putting into some color, and I'm there, completely. But it only lasts a minute, or perhaps half an hour when I get into this watercolor. And not that, and moments. That's all.
That, in fact, is a glimpse of the Holy Grail. And in fact, in the myth, the knights always had a glimpse, and it was always just enough to send them on the quest. It was just that glimpse, that moment, that could change your life around and move you and call you to come further toward it. Now, in terms of humanity, were we ever in paradise? Everybody has a paradise story. Everybody's got a paradise story. Why? What is that? Is it just the longing to return to the womb? Could be that. Somehow we have an unconscious memory of what that was and long to return to it. Is that it? Or is it, in fact, a collective memory of an actual time in history when, in fact, there was a paradise, when, in fact, there was completion and wholeness within community? Do we, as a race, have that memory and are, in fact, longing to return to that? It seems, and archaeologists are unearthing evidence to indicate that in old Europe, that is, around Romania, Hungary, those places around there in Eastern Europe, there seemed to be indication that there was a period of 4,000 years. 4,000 years, that's about the time since Egypt to here. 4,000 years when there was no war.
They're making up for it.
They're unearthing a culture that was clearly in relationship to a female deity, when the goddess was in fact present, and they're finding the artifacts that show her presence. But at the same time, a culture with no fortifications that would indicate the need to defend itself. No weapons to indicate the need to attack. 4,000 years of history, human history, Neolithic. Is that our memory? Is that what all of the cosmogony and stories of every tribe, every people, is that what it's remembering? I don't know. It's a question. But the circle we're talking about could be a personal one and a spiritual one, but it could also be a collective one. That in fact is possible. That this may not be what human nature and human society needs to be. But in fact, there may be another possibility that in fact our race of humanity has already known. Either way, I am an individual, you as an individual, and we as a people are on our journey. However, the circle is broken. The circle is broken, we've left the womb. The circle is broken as a people. That paradise no longer exists, even if it once did. So we're on our own. Helen.
Is there anything in those Grail legends about the cup being dropped and broken?
Not that I've read. Have you read something?
I think I did. Yeah, way back. I just wondered with the circle being broken.
Yeah.
The Grail.
Right. That would be a nice touch, wouldn't it? Yeah. No, the sword breaks. I guess we'll put that together again. Yeah, the sword breaks and the perilous seat breaks. And just put back together. I haven't read anything about the cup breaking.
Well, circles are complete, they don't break.
You're right.
And that's the difference.
Well, the circle, yeah. So, but we're expelled from it. We've come out of it as people or as an individual. We've come out of that circle of unity.
But the Bible, the biblical paradise is not circle. So, it's just one theme of
Why isn't the biblical paradise a circle?
the way it's described. It's a garden.
Why is that?
Garden of Eden? No, I'm just trying to think.
Right, I know.
I never
You're working
thought
with
of
symbols,
paradise
right.
as
Yeah,
circle.
right.
There's also that water.
And I'm using the circle as a metaphor also, What are you saying about water?
Those water, in one of those paradise stories, there are those rivers.
Right.
That well, and there's what do we mean, living water, but there's water.
Right.
There's then where the Titus is coming, there's a certain point that has a name, but there are those 4 rivers.
Right.
And that is the story that we are not taught in 2nd grade, right? We get only the garden and the apple.
Right.
But we don't get the story of the water and the well. Never thought of that, why not?
Right.
The water streaming through the garden.
Yes.
In the
Yes.
Bible.
Yes.
The water comes back to us in a circle.
Right. And also in the garden is the tree of life,
Yes, right.
Yeah.
which one in the Christian story, want to get back out of it, I told you, there's when Eve and Adam were expelled from the garden, Eve, she was irascible, I tell you, she took a twig from that tree of life and brought it with her. And she planted it
Good for her.
in the next place that they went. And it was under that tree that Cain killed Abel. And it was from that tree that Jesus' crucifixion was also associated with being crucified in the tree of life as part of the redemption. And in the myth, Galahad and a whole bunch of the sub-point are on a boat. And in that boat is a bed. And on that, bed has been constructed and is surrounded by wood from the tree of life. And Galahad is supposed to go to sleep in that bed, which was another way of hooking him up with the right. It's just one detail, not necessarily related to the circle. Well, the tree of life, as you understand, does come up and it goes out and it goes back into the earth. And there is that. It's a metaphor.
It just reminds me that Jesus' father was a carpenter, too.
Yeah. Right. Either way, as individuals or as a people, we are on our journey. Yeah. And there's some way in which perhaps some of us or individuals might believe that you, our little group here, are somehow further ahead on the journey to the point of quest than others might be. We might feel that I, as an individual, will now go toward the light. I will now go toward my God, and I can do that. And I can pass through all of this, and I can get there. It's true. We've taken this individual path. But it may also be true that certainly as incarnate beings, because we as a people aren't moving together I mean a whole people. Because we're not moving together. Maybe we can't go as far as we might if we were moving on the journey as a collective together. This might possibly take us even farther. There was a certain value in the introduction of the individual and the individualism that came into Europe at a certain point in the Middle Ages. But it has taken us in a certain direction of individuality, which has also helped us to lose our sense of the tribal and the sense of the people. And this is me speaking personally. I've often had the feeling that somehow I could go further if I was moving with more than myself. If I were living in another social realm that in fact supported the spirit, that in fact, as we know in certain societies, that we might call undeveloped, but in fact are still rooted in a sense of collectivity, and that in fact are far more connected to the presence of spirit in everyday life than we are. So there's something about the journey. We want to affirm the individual journey, but not to lose sight of that we as a people are on a journey. And in fact, if we don't get it straight, this here wasteland is going to be the end of it all. We know that we are at a point in time in human history that we are in grave danger. That what's happening to the planet, first of all, in terms of the pollution and all that is happening with what we are doing with the land, with the goddess, with the land, all of that, we could extinguish ourselves. The earth will go on. We, the people, may not. So on a personal journey, on a collective journey into the wasteland and through it. One question might be, if you were to think of where the wasteland is in our time, or what the wasteland is in our time. I know there's the personal one, and that is personal. I'm sure you might not want to just jump up and say, well, I'm in the wasteland now because, at a personal level. But at a social level, where do you see signs of the wasteland in our time?
Tribal conflicts in both in Eastern Europe and in Africa are terrific. So when we talk about being part of a tribe, I mean, this is...
It's very complex, isn't it? The dark and the light.
Homelessness in the United States is always the dark and the light.
The tribal without calling our tribe people and everyone else pagans or savages.
Right, so what is this about which tribe is which? And perhaps we're all one tribe. That was possible. And then I thought, I was thinking about the homes. I'm here in this place. We came to this place very intentionally to do the program here because we wanted to support the project here. And I was feeling like, man, this is a great place. Here we are in the midst of what might be perceived as a wasteland. But in fact, there are so many signs of life and spirit here. And then I realized for me, go to the suburbs. Yeah. There's all time out there where everything is nice and neat and in order. Oh, it's like, man, this is a wasteland.
Even outside of the suburbs, the strip malls and the malls.
Yeah, oh, geez, right. Right. Ugly.
Yeah.
I had that experience at Valley Forge, where all the malls are.
King of Prussia is the wasteland. Because it's filled with waste. Also. You know how much garbage we put out every day?
Every day.
Millions of tons of garbage every day. Helen, what were you going to say?
No, I was just teasing. I said, have you been to King of Prussia Mall?
No, I haven't been there yet, but I've been to others. And I remember once that I was taking the train from Cincinnati to Washington, D.C. at night. And it passes through West Virginia and the mining and all of those mines and these things that exude smoke. And it was nighttime and it was all lit up. I felt like I just got into hell.
Yeah.
if you've ever passed through something like that at night, and all that smoke coming out, and all those lights and things sticking up in the dark, that for me was the wasteland.
A lot of this is just colored by your perspective because in the King of Prussia area is nothing more than the new downtown.
Right.
So what's the difference between the King of Prussia, concrete complex, and the downtown?
I think it has something to do with what it was built on. I don't know. I sometimes feel like I wonder what was.
There is a closer to the fact that it was owned part of nature, whereas the city did too, but that happened 200 years ago. So we're further away from it, but we
It's just overwhelming in one place, King of Prussia Mall.
It's that place I'm talking about.
Overwhelming.
Maybe some people like to go to King of Prussia.
I said about downtown Philadelphia, New York City, so it's all perfect.
Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. I do anything good without having bad consequences. And I'm thinking when your story about West Virginia, somebody else could look at it as jobs.
Exactly. And food, that's right, and food, and putting stuff on the family's table, that's right, absolutely. Or even a situation like the problem of the trees and the Amazon, everyone's saying, oh, we gotta preserve the Amazon, and the Brazilians are saying, wait a minute, you guys up there in the north, you cut down all your trees, you had all those trees, and you cut them all down, and you made lots of money. And you built up a whole thing when you got your air conditioners and your refrigerators and you're killing the ozone, you're doing all that stuff. And now you want us, to not develop and to not cut down our trees?
Well, it depends on what Brazilians you're talking about. If you're talking about the ones that are indigenous to that environment, I'm sure that's not the argument that they're getting because they're not making the money from selling the trees.
Well, that's another story.
People say it's much
That's right. The complexity of it. That's right. Yes.
May I just comment, as we've been talking through these different symbols or archetypes, the circle is there were a few comments, but the wasteland is one we all seem to know a lot about.
Yes. And we haven't even touched together the personal one at this point.
No.
And hopefully we might. All right. The question. All of these, we have made a whole bunch of comments, right? And it really wasn't getting us very far. Was it? It might have been interesting if we started to look for what the question was in this situation. We might have had a more fruitful dialogue if we were just combining the word questions. What's the thought? Yes. And what would the question be for your life personally as well at this time? What is the question that you're following? We're all trying to answer a question. But maybe that's the problem too, and that's part of what this tells us. It's not about necessarily getting the answer, it's about being willing to live the question and not have the answer. And the healing, in fact, comes from being willing to live inside that question, even when there is no apparent answer. But what is the question that's moving you in your life now? And what might be the question for us as a people that we need to be willing to live in order to move together toward this realm that I think we want to believe isn't just for me, but for all of us.
Could I just bring the question back into the wasteland again? Because back to the malls. Approaching the malls,
I like the mall too.
You get into such a frozen, paralyzed situation where people, I think they're answering the question, what do I need? I'll go to the mall and get it. And you get out on that road and you can hardly get there. It becomes more and more of a traffic jam. It's becoming more and more of a parking problem, more and more inaccessible. And the answer being provided just keeps it built bigger, more malls, and that's supposed to be the answer. But I can't help thinking that there's different answers to that question, and that you just get out on that rat race, you get out on the expressways, there's something very insane about what we're doing, very sick. And yet we're going there because that's where, like this woman said, well, it's the new downtown, it's where people go, what's the difference? It's the thing that's thrown out there for us, and it says, this is what you need. When you're home looking at your television, we're telling you, go up to that mall to get it. Get in your car and get in that traffic jam. And it's obvious that some questions have to be asked about what we're doing.
So maybe for the question, and your question in relation to that was, what do I, what I heard, the question I heard was, what do I really need?
Yeah. Other than what they're saying we need. We're being told.
The question comes from inside. The question comes from inside. That's your question in relation to the mall. And Grace would have another question.
There's a misconception about me like a mall. I haven't been to the senior freshman. Since they redid it, I certainly have been. But I was just pointing out, as you say, the complexity and the fact that. And actually, his point about accessibility, that's their rationale for them, is it's more accessible at that intersection. You know, it's to make it more accessible.
Right.
More is better.
Is more better?
Is more better would be a very.
That would be a question.
A good question.
To quest. It will bring us to a quest. And if in living that question, this is my quest, not in finding the answer, but in being willing to live that question and to let it take me where the question is leading me. To let myself be taken by the question. And sometimes that is really scary. To let go of the reins of the horse and live the question. If you really let that question in, sometimes it can mean everything in your world as you've known it could fall apart. You don't know. That's the other part. You get so scared of the question that you want to suppress it because you're afraid what the implication is. You don't even know because you haven't even lived the question yet.
And when you start to raise the question, it's not just one question. It begins to affect your whole life, every aspect of it.
One question only brings you to the next question.
Exactly, and there's so the answer. But it's so contradictory to Western way of thinking because we're supposed to have the answers. That's what our schools are all about, having the answers. We don't go to school to question anything. So it's very hard to even reach that point where it's okay to ask the question. Never mind live with ambiguity without the unknowingness. It's an exact dichotomy of what we're all about. And it's so hard to live it. That's what makes it so difficult. It's scary. No, it's like you say, the answer, it's there, it's right there, tomorrow's going to come. I know it. Something's going to come in the mail, I'm going to meet somebody on the street. The next book I buy. It's a whole library, whole bookshelf full of books. It's there, I just haven't found it.
What's your name? I can't see your name now. Valentine?
Oh, Valentine. When she mentioned answer, I remember my dad used to tell my two brothers and I that the answer lies within the question. And I always like that centering and deep meditation, and you will get an answer.
Right.
Do the question.
And April, I wanted to say something very like that. Just this conversation brings to my mind a memory of the first 2 to 3 weeks I was ever at Grailville in my whole life in 1969 for a semester Grailville program. And we were setting up the learning groups we were going to have. And we had to have, like, I want to learn about da-da-da. It had to be in the form of a question. It was required that all the students put whatever their learning objective was in the form of a question. And I can remember Janet Calvin saying, you never know if you found out unless you have a good question. You have to have a good question. And I've always remembered that, but I never understood it quite. So this conversation, new understanding of it.
But you want to know something that makes me think that maybe Jeopardy is like the ultimate.
They call it Jeopardy. What's Jeopardy about that show?
Why? And they all have putting it in the form of a question. Your answer is in the form of a question. It was just like a frame of question.
We're sitting here talking about Jeopardy.
Yeah, we were just talking.
Yeah, we were just talking about Jeopardy.
But Jeopardy may be the answer. We should be watching Jeopardy.
So many things use a name like that for that show. Isn't that fascinating?
That's true. Jeopardy. All of this, we have faith, love, compassion, and are willing to let go, might bring us into the light.
And what would the light be for you? What's your light? That's a question. What's your light? Maybe it's there already. Maybe it's in your life already and you're living in it. And somehow, whatever that light is for you is really talking about what your Holy Grail is. And then another question. What would it be like if this was a world of light? What would it take to have that happen? And what would it look like? We as a people, in fact, could fulfill what's supposed to be the gospel promise. The gospel promise was there would be the new creation. And that would be, at the social level, the coming of the Holy Grail amongst all of us. I would like, if you can, and I hate this, when someone asks me to do this, I'm going to ask you to do it. We got some art materials over there. We got some crayons and pencils and paper. You could take maybe 15 minutes and get into any one of these or all of these, whatever field, whatever energy is strongest for you. And somehow make a representation of it, either through drawing, abstract, realistic, whatever information you have, or through words. However, but somehow just to focus your attention on where the energy is greatest for you in these things, personally. And that might be related to your own search or this collective journey, whichever, however you want to go with it. But where is the point of energy for you in relation to what we've been talking about for the last half hour?